The skin on Betty Cash's palms began to blister before she even realized she was screaming. It was 9 o'clock on the night of December 29, 1980, and the diamond-shaped object hovering above Farm Road 1471 was so bright, so impossibly brilliant, that the darkness of the East Texas pine forest had transformed into something resembling noon. But this wasn't sunlight. This was heat that moved like a living thing, rolling across the two-lane highway in waves you could see, distorting the air itself into shimmering curtains of superheated atmosphere. Betty had pulled her Oldsmobile Cutlass to a stop because there was nowhere else to go. The thing, whatever it was, sat directly above the road ahead, maybe 100 feet in the air, maybe less. It was hard to judge distance when your brain kept insisting that what you were seeing couldn't exist. The object was massive, diamond-shaped, wider than the road itself. Its surface appeared metallic, but along its center ran a belt of what looked like blue lights, pulsing with an intensity that made your eyes water. And from its bottom, from a cone-shaped underbelly, came fire. Not exhaust, not anything mechanical, just fire, brilliant orange and red, shooting downward in periodic bursts that made the asphalt beneath it glow. Vickie Landrum sat in the passenger seat, her 7-year-old grandson Colby pressed against her side in the front bench seat. She was praying out loud, her voice rising over the strange roaring sound that filled the car, a sound like a blast furnace, like standing too close to a jet engine. Colby was crying, his small hands covering his ears, his face buried against his grandmother's arm. Betty should have stayed in the car. Later, when the doctors asked her to recount every decision she made that night, this would be the moment she returned to again and again. She should have stayed in the car. But the heat was so intense that even with the air conditioning running full blast, the interior of the Oldsmobile was becoming unbearable. The vinyl dashboard was too hot to touch. The steering wheel was warm beneath her hands, and she needed to see. She needed it to understand what was happening. When she opened the driver's side door, the heat hit her like a physical wall. It wasn't just warm. It was the kind of heat that lives inside industrial furnaces, that smelts metal, that should not exist in the open air on a cool December night in the piney woods of Texas. She stepped out onto the road, and even through the soles of her shoes, she could feel the pavement radiating warmth. The object was moving slightly now, drifting upward, and in that moment of movement, Betty saw something that would haunt her for what remained of her life. The thing was struggling. Whatever it was, it seemed to be fighting to stay aloft, periodically blasting fire from its base as if to keep itself from falling. With each burst, the heat intensified. With each burst, Betty felt her exposed skin begin to prickle and burn. She stood there for perhaps a minute, perhaps longer. Time had become unreliable. Then, she heard them. The helicopters. They came from the south, flying low and fast. Big helicopters, military helicopters. Double-rotor Chinooks that she recognized from television news footage of Vietnam. Sleek Hueys, others she couldn't identify. They surrounded the object, circling it, maintaining a careful distance but clearly, unmistakably, escorting it, herding it. 23 helicopters in total, Vickie would count later, after Betty had gotten back in the car, after they'd driven away with the convoy passing overhead, the choppers following the diamond-shaped craft northeast toward Texarkana. But before Betty returned to the car, she had to close the door. The door she'd left open. And the handle, the chrome door handle that had been sitting in that incredible heat for those long minutes, had become something else entirely. When her hand closed around it, the metal was so hot, it didn't just burn. It stuck. For a fraction of a second, her flesh adhered to the superheated chrome before survival instinct made her jerk away. The smell of her own burning skin filled her nostrils as she fell into the driver's seat. They drove home in a kind of shocked silence, interrupted only by Colby's periodic crying and Vickie's continued prayers. Within hours, all three of them would begin vomiting. Their skin would redden, then blister. Their hair would start falling out in clumps. Betty's eyes would swell shut. The handprint-shaped burns on her palms and fingers would weep and crack and refuse to heal. The doctors who eventually examined them, after weeks of increasing illness, forced them into hospitals, would document symptoms consistent with exposure to intense ionizing radiation, skin damage, hair loss, immune system collapse, damage to their eyes, nausea, and diarrhea. All the hallmarks of radiation poisoning, appearing in 3 previously healthy people after a single night on a lonely Texas road. But radiation from what? That was the question that would consume the rest of Betty Cash's life. A life that would be drastically shortened by that December night. What had they encountered that could burn human skin through a car windshield? What kind of craft required military escort by nearly 24 helicopters? And why, when Betty and Vickie began seeking answers, did every branch of the United States government insist they had no idea what the women were talking about? No experimental aircraft in that area. No military exercises. No helicopters. Nothing in the sky that night but 3 ordinary people's imagination. Except Betty's hands told a different story, and the medical records told a different story. And the slow, horrible deterioration of her health told a different story that ended with her death in December of 1998, exactly 18 years after the encounter. Her body finally surrendering to cancers and complications that physicians linked directly to radiation exposure. What was so dangerous that it left 3 people with radiation burns? And why would the government rather deny everything than provide a single answer? Nick. December 29, 1980. A Monday evening settling over East Texas with the kind of quiet that felt like a soft blanket over a sleeping child. The day after a holiday weekend, when most folks were still digesting leftover turkey and pie, still savoring those last precious hours before the new year arrived and brought with it all the promises and resolutions people tell themselves they'll keep. Betty Cash sat in the driver's seat of her brand new Oldsmobile Cutlass, her hands resting comfortably on the steering wheel, feeling that particular pride that comes from owning something beautiful that you worked hard to earn. Tar still had that new car smell, that mixture of vinyl and possibility. She was 51 years old, and everything in her life was finally coming together the way she'd always dreamed it would. Betty had built her business from nothing. The Dayton Cafe and Grocery, right there in the heart of Dayton, Texas, was hers. Every booth, every counter stool, every can of beans on the shelf represented her sweat, her determination, her refusal to accept the limitations other people tried to place on a woman running her own establishment. She'd wake up before dawn to start the coffee brewing, stay late counting receipts by the light of a single bulb in the back office. Her regulars knew her by name, trusted her cooking, relied on the way she'd extend credit when times were tough, and never make them feel small for needing the help. She was a woman who understood hard work because she'd never known anything else. Short, stocky, with dark hair, she kept practical and eyes that could soften with kindness or harden with business sense, depending on what the moment required. People respected Betty Cash. They knew she was fair, knew she was tough, knew that if you were straight with her, she'd be straight with you. Tonight, though, work was the furthest thing from her mind. Tonight was about friendship, about the people who mattered most when you stripped away all the business transactions and daily obligations and got down to what really made life worth living. In the passenger seat beside her sat Vickie Landrum, 57 years old, grandmother, friend, a woman whose entire life revolved around family and faith in equal measure. Vickie had that particular kind of strength that Southern women of her generation carried like an invisible armor. She'd raised her children, watched them grow and start families of their own, and now she poured all that mothering energy into her grandchildren, especially the boy sitting in the backseat. Colby Landrum was 7 years old, bright-eyed and buzzing with the kind of energy only young children possess, that magical ability to find excitement in the simplest things. He'd been looking forward to this dinner all day, talking about what he was going to order, whether he'd have enough room for dessert, chattering away the way kids do when they're happy and safe and surrounded by people who love them. The 3 of them had just finished dinner at a restaurant in New Caney, a small establishment where the portions were generous and the prices were fair and nobody rushed you out the door if you wanted to linger over coffee and conversation. They'd laughed and talked, shared stories about the holiday, made plans for the new year that was just days away. Ordinary things. Beautiful things. The kind of evening that doesn't seem special when you're living it, but becomes precious beyond measure when you look back and realize how fragile that kind of peace really is. Betty and Vickie had been friends for years, the kind of friendship that didn't require constant maintenance or dramatic declarations. They simply showed up for each other, understood each other's struggles without needing lengthy explanations, celebrated each other's victories without a trace of jealousy. Vickie often helped out at the cafe when Betty needed an extra pair of hands, and Betty was always willing to watch the grandkids when Vickie needed a break. It was the kind of practical love that holds communities together, that makes life in small towns feel like something worth protecting. Colby called both women Nana, a term of endearment that blurred the lines between biological grandmother and chosen family. To him, they were both sources of safety and affection, both keepers of secrets and givers of treats when his mother wasn't looking. Tonight he was tired in that good way children get after a full belly and a pleasant evening, his energy finally starting to wind down as the darkness outside the car windows grew deeper. Betty turned the Cutlass onto FM 1485, a rural highway that cut through the piney woods between New Caney and Dayton. This was their route home, a road they'd traveled countless times before. Farm to Market Road 1485 was exactly what its designation suggested. A two-lane strip of asphalt that connected small communities and agricultural areas. The kind of road where you might not see another car for miles, where the darkness between scattered houses felt absolute and ancient. The headlights carved a tunnel through the blackness, illuminating pine trees that pressed close to the road's edge like silent witnesses. This was deep East Texas, where the woods still held mysteries, where families had lived on the same land for generations, where the boundary between civilization and wilderness felt thin and permeable. During the day, these roads had a certain charm, a pastoral quality that made you appreciate the slower pace of rural life. At night, they transformed into something else entirely, reminded you that humans were still relative newcomers to this landscape, that the forest had been here long before the roads cut through it, and would remain long after. But none of that bothered Betty or Vickie or young Colby. This was their home, their territory. They knew these roads the way you know the hallways of your own house in the dark, could navigate by instinct and familiarity. The darkness didn't frighten them. They were safe together, heading home after a simple pleasure, thinking about nothing more complicated than what needed to be done tomorrow. Whether the cafe would be busy, what Colby might want for breakfast. The car hummed along smoothly, that new engine purring with mechanical precision. Betty had worked hard for this car, had saved and planned, and finally treated herself to something nice. She loved the way it handled, the way it made her feel successful and capable. The radio played softly, some country station broadcasting out of Houston, the music a gentle companion to the rhythm of tires on pavement. Vickie glanced back at Colby, saw his eyelids getting heavy, smiled that grandmother smile that contains entire oceans of love. She thought about getting him home, tucked into bed, the way his small body would curl up under the blankets and surrender completely to sleep. She thought about her own bed waiting, about the comfort of familiar routines, about the week ahead with all its ordinary demands and small joys. None of them could have imagined what was coming. How could they? They were just regular people living regular lives in a small corner of Texas that most Americans couldn't find on a map. Betty with her cafe, Vickie with her grandchildren, Colby with his innocent trust that the adults in his life would keep him safe from anything the world might throw his way. The forest rolled past on either side, dark and deep and keeping its secrets. The road stretched ahead, empty and familiar. The clock in the dashboard marked the passing minutes, each one bringing them closer to something that would change everything, that would transform this ordinary evening into something that defied explanation, that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But in that moment, rolling through the East Texas darkness, they were still just themselves, still innocent, still normal, still believing that the world made sense and that terrible things happened to other people in other places, never to folks just trying to live quiet lives and get home safe after a pleasant dinner. They had no way of knowing that in just a few minutes, the ordinary world they trusted would crack wide open and reveal something underneath that shouldn't exist. Something that would leave them changed forever. Something that would raise questions nobody could answer and inflict damage nobody could heal. For now, though, they were still safe, still whole. Still three people who loved each other, heading home through the darkness, the new Cutlass carrying them toward a fate they never could have anticipated and would never fully escape. The evening of December 29, 1980, began like any other winter night in East Texas. Betty Cash was behind the wheel of her 1980 Oldsmobile Cutlass, guiding it along the lonely two-lane road that cut through the dense pine forests between New Caney and Huffman. Beside her sat her friend Vickie Landrum, a woman she had known for years, someone she trusted implicitly. In the back seat, Vickie's 7-year-old grandson Colby bounced with the restless energy of a child who had spent the evening playing at a diner and was now ready to go home. The road ahead stretched into darkness, illuminated only by the car's headlights. The radio played softly. Everything was ordinary, mundane even. The forest pressed in on both sides of the road, creating walls of shadow punctuated by the occasional gap where moonlight filtered through bare winter branches. Betty kept her speed steady, her hands relaxed on the steering wheel. They were making good time. They would be home soon. Then Colby saw it first. The boy had been looking out the window, watching the trees slip past, when something caught his attention through the windshield. A light. Not the kind of light you dismiss immediately. Not a distant street lamp or another car's headlights. This light was wrong somehow, moving when it should have been still, positioned where nothing should be floating in the air above the road ahead. Colby leaned forward between the front seats, his small hand reaching out to point. His voice carried that particular urgency that children use when they see something adults might miss. "Look," he said. "Look at that light." Betty's eyes shifted from the road to where the child was pointing. At first, she saw only a bright glow somewhere above the tree line, maybe a mile or two ahead. Her mind began the automatic process of rational explanation. An airplane, perhaps. A helicopter with a searchlight. Something ordinary that would reveal itself to be completely normal in just a few more moments. But as they drove closer, that comforting rationality began to crumble. The light grew larger, brighter, more defined. It was not moving away like a distant aircraft. It was not following any predictable path. Instead, it seemed to hover directly over the road ahead of them, and as the distance closed, its true nature became impossible to dismiss or explain away. Vickie saw it now too. Her voice, usually calm and measured, carried a note of confusion. "What is that thing, Betty?" Betty did not answer. She could not answer. Her attention was completely absorbed by what she was seeing. The object was massive, far larger than she had initially realized. It was not a light. It was a craft of some kind, and it was descending. The shape resolved itself as they approached. Diamond-shaped, or perhaps more accurately like two pyramids joined at their bases, creating a distinctive silhouette against the night sky. The entire structure glowed with an intense, fiery brilliance that hurt to look at directly. The air around it seemed to shimmer and distort, the way pavement shimmers on a scorching summer day. Betty's foot moved instinctively to the brake. The car began to slow. Every instinct screamed at her to stop, to not drive any closer to this thing that defied all logic and experience. The Oldsmobile rolled to a halt, approximately 135 feet from where the object hung in the air, directly above the road, blocking their path forward. They sat there for a moment in stunned silence, the engine idling, the radio still playing its forgotten song. The object descended further, dropping down toward the treetops with a ponderous, deliberate motion. It was close now, terrifyingly close. Betty would later estimate it hovered no more than 60 feet above the road, just barely clearing the tops of the pine trees that lined both sides. The craft was enormous. From their vantage point, Betty judged it to be roughly the size of a water tower, though its diamond shape made exact comparisons difficult. The surface seemed to be metallic, but the intense glow made details hard to discern. What drew the eye, what made it impossible to look away, were the flames. Fire erupted from the bottom of the craft in periodic bursts. Not like rocket exhaust, not like anything they had seen before. These were columns of flame that shot downward with tremendous force, extending far below the object itself. Each burst was accompanied by a sound, a roaring whoosh that they could hear even through the closed windows of the car. The flames were not simply orange or red. They were a complex, shifting pattern of colors, predominantly blue and orange, cycling through the spectrum with each discharge. Then came the beeping. It was rhythmic, mechanical, insistent. Beep, deep, beep, it, beep, it, a steady pattern that seemed to emanate from the craft itself. The sound penetrated the car's interior, impossible to block out or ignore. It was not particularly loud, but it carried a quality that made it impossible to tune out, like an alarm clock that reaches into your sleep and drags you to consciousness whether you want to wake or not. The heat came next. At first, it was merely noticeable. The temperature inside the car began to rise. Betty felt sweat prickling on her forehead. Then it escalated rapidly. The heat became oppressive, unbearable, dangerous. It was as if they had opened an oven door and leaned into the blast. The air itself seemed to thicken and burn. Colby was crying now, his small voice frightened and confused. It was too hot. The car's interior was becoming an oven. Betty's mind raced through her options. They could not drive forward. The object blocked the road completely. They could back up, turn around, flee. But something about the situation, perhaps shock, perhaps sheer disbelief, kept her frozen for those critical few seconds. Then Vickie moved. The older woman reached for the door handle, her intention clear. She was going to get out, maybe to get a better look. Maybe because the heat inside the car had become intolerable. Betty grabbed her arm. "No," she said. Her voice was sharp, urgent. "We need to stay in the car." But Vickie had already opened the door. The blast of heat that rushed in was overwhelming, like standing directly in front of a blast furnace. The temperature outside was even worse than inside. Vickie stepped out onto the pavement, one foot, then the other. Betty, compelled by concern for her friend, by the need to understand what was happening, by forces she could not later fully articulate, followed. The moment Betty's feet touched the asphalt, she knew they had made a terrible mistake. The heat was not just uncomfortable. It was dangerous, physically threatening. The air itself seemed to sear her lungs with each breath. She squinted against the brilliant light, trying to see details of the craft above them, but the intensity made it nearly impossible. Colby remained in the back seat, his face pressed against the window, tears streaming down his cheeks. The women stood beside the car, transfixed by the impossible sight above them. The craft hung there, flames shooting rhythmically from its base, that maddening beeping, continuing its endless pattern. The entire scene was bathed in a red glow, as if the world itself had been dipped in blood. Then Betty noticed the helicopters. At first, she saw just a few dark silhouettes against the night sky, circling at a distance. Then more appeared. And more. They came from different directions, converging on the location of the diamond-shaped craft. Their lights blinked in standard aviation patterns. Their shapes were familiar, recognizable. These were military helicopters, and Betty, who had lived near military installations and had seen helicopters before, could identify the distinctive profile. Chinooks. Twin-rotor Chaksh 47 Chinooks Orsh. She began counting them. 1, 2, 3, 4. She lost count, started again. More kept arriving. They formed a pattern around the central object, maintaining their distance but clearly focused on it. The sight was somehow both terrifying and reassuring. Terrifying because it confirmed that this was real, that she was not hallucinating or dreaming. Whatever this object was, the military knew about it. They were responding to it. But reassuring too, because the presence of military aircraft suggested some level of control, some human response to the inexplicable. Vickie counted them too. Later, both women would agree on the number. 23 helicopters. All of them appeared to be Chaksh 47 Chinooks, that distinctive double-rotor design unmistakable even in the darkness and chaos of the moment. 23 military helicopters surrounding a craft that looked like nothing built by human hands. The heat intensified further. Betty felt her skin beginning to burn. The sensation was immediate and alarming. This was not just discomfort. This was actual physical damage occurring in real time. She touched her face and felt the heat radiating from her own skin. Her eyes were watering, her vision blurring. "We have to get back in the car," Betty shouted to Vickie. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distorted by the roar of the flames and the persistent beeping. They moved back toward the Oldsmobile. The door handle was blazing hot. Betty grabbed it anyway, crying out as the metal seared her palm, but she jerked the door open. Vickie was climbing into the passenger seat. Betty slid behind the wheel, pulling the door closed against that terrible heat outside. But inside offered little relief. The entire car had become superheated. Betty's hands found the steering wheel and recoiled. The vinyl covering was burning hot to the touch. She forced herself to grip it anyway, her palms screaming in protest. The dashboard glowed with absorbed heat. When she braced her hand against it to steady herself, fresh pain shot through her fingers. Colby was sobbing in the back seat, his small frame curled into a ball, trying to make himself as small as possible. Vickie was praying, her voice low and urgent, a stream of desperate words seeking divine intervention. The object above them pulsed with energy. The flame shot downward again, and in that brilliant flash of light, Betty saw scorch marks appearing on the road surface below the craft. The asphalt itself was melting, bubbling under the intense heat. She realized with a cold shock of terror that they were directly in the path of that heat, that if the object dropped any lower, or if those flames extended any further, they would all burn alive in this car. The helicopters maintained their pattern, circling, observing, but not intervening. Why did they not do something? Why did they not drive it away or shoot it down or communicate with it? They just circled endlessly, witnesses like Betty and Vickie and Colby, but with the power to act and yet choosing not to. Time became elastic, unreliable. Later, Betty would estimate the entire ordeal lasted approximately 20 minutes, though in the moment it felt both longer and shorter. 20 minutes of unbearable heat. 20 minutes of that mechanical beeping drilling into her skull. 20 minutes of watching something impossible hang in the air while military helicopters circled like vultures. Then, finally, the object began to rise. The ascent was slow at first, grudging, as if whatever force held it aloft had to strain against gravity. The flames increased in intensity, shooting downward with even greater force. The diamond shape climbed higher, clearing the treetops, rising into the night sky. The helicopters followed. All 23 of them adjusted their positions, maintaining their circular formation around the craft as it ascended. Betty, her hands blistered and raw, turned the steering wheel and guided the car off the road slightly, craning her neck to keep the object in view through the windshield as it climbed higher and higher. The procession moved slowly across the sky, heading roughly northeast. The craft led, glowing like a second sun. The helicopters surrounded it, their navigation lights blinking in formation. Betty started the car forward, following the aerial convoy, unable to tear her eyes away despite the pain, despite the terror, despite everything rational, telling her to drive in the opposite direction. They followed for several miles before the object gained enough altitude to disappear from view, the helicopters scattering into the darkness after it. Only then did Betty fully register the pain in her hands, the throbbing burns on her face, the way Colby had gone silent in the back seat. Only then did the full weight of what had just happened begin to settle over them like a suffocating blanket. They were alone again on the dark road, three ordinary people who had witnessed something that should not exist. The evening of December 20th, 1985, began like any other for Betty Cash. But within hours of her encounter on that lonely Texas road, her body began to betray her in ways that would horrify medical professionals and defy easy explanation. What started as simple discomfort rapidly escalated into a medical nightmare that would consume not just Betty, but Vickie Landrum and young Colby as well, leaving a trail of documentation that reads like something from a radiation disaster zone rather than a quiet night in the piney woods of Texas. Betty arrived home that night feeling uneasy, but she attributed her discomfort to the stress of the encounter. She had stood closest to the object, had absorbed the most heat from that diamond-shaped craft hovering above the trees. Within just a few hours, the first symptoms began to manifest. Her stomach churned with a nausea so intense that she found herself doubled over, unable to keep down even water. Her eyes, which had stared directly at the brilliant light emanating from the craft, began to burn with an intensity that made it impossible to find relief. She pressed cold compresses against her eyelids, but nothing seemed to help. The pain radiated through her skull, a deep, persistent ache that would become her constant companion in the days and weeks ahead. By the next morning, December 21st, Betty's condition had deteriorated dramatically. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the face staring back at her. Angry red welts had erupted across her skin, concentrated most heavily on the areas that had been exposed during the encounter. Her face, her neck, the back of her scalp. These were not ordinary burns. The blisters formed in patterns, some small and scattered, others large and weeping, filled with clear fluid that spoke to the severity of the damage her skin had sustained. The pain was excruciating, a constant burning sensation that felt as though her skin was still being exposed to some invisible source of heat. Within days, Betty's hair began to fall out, not gradually, as sometimes happens with illness or stress, but in clumps, great handfuls of hair that came away when she touched her scalp. She would run her fingers through what remained and watch in horror as strands collected in her palm, her hairbrush, on her pillow each morning. The hair loss followed the same pattern as the burns, most severe in the areas that had faced the object during those terrifying minutes on farm to Market Road 1471. The skin on Betty's face and neck began to peel away in sheets, revealing raw, tender flesh beneath. The burns covered her body in ways that suggested she had been exposed to something far more dangerous than simple heat. Medical professionals, who would later examine her, noted that the patterns and severity of the injuries were consistent with radiation burns, the kind of damage typically seen only in victims of nuclear accidents or individuals who had received massive doses of ionizing radiation. But Betty had not been anywhere near a nuclear facility. She had simply driven down a rural Texas road on a winter evening. By Christmas Day, just 5 days after the encounter, Betty's condition had become so severe that hospitalization was no longer optional. Her family rushed her to the emergency room, where doctors struggled to understand what they were seeing. Her white blood cell count had plummeted, her immune system seemingly under attack from within. The burns continued to worsen, covering more of her body, going deeper into the tissue. She developed severe diarrhea and vomiting that left her dehydrated and weak. Her temperature spiked and crashed unpredictably. Medical staff documented everything, creating a record that would later prove invaluable in understanding what had happened to these 3 witnesses. Betty's hospitalization marked the beginning of a long and agonizing journey through the medical system. Over the following weeks and months, she would be admitted to hospitals multiple times, each visit documenting new horrors as her body continued to break down. She experienced what doctors recognized as symptoms matching acute radiation syndrome, the same constellation of medical problems seen in people exposed to high levels of radiation. Her bone marrow struggled to produce blood cells. Her digestive system remained in chaos. The burns refused to heal properly, leaving scars that would mark her skin for the rest of her life. But Betty was not suffering alone. Vickie Landrum, who had spent less time exposed to the object and had been partially shielded by the car, developed her own set of horrifying symptoms. The burns on her skin followed a distinctive pattern, appearing most prominently on one side of her body, the side that had faced the window during the encounter. Medical professionals noted this pattern because it suggested directional exposure, as if something had been radiating from a specific source, burning one side more severely than the other. Her hair also began to fall out, though not as extensively as Betty's. The loss followed the same directional pattern as her burns, another clue that whatever had affected them came from outside the vehicle, from the direction of that diamond-shaped crack. Vickie's eyes suffered tremendous damage. The woman who had tried to shield young Colby, who had looked up at the object despite her fear, paid a terrible price for those moments of exposure. Her vision deteriorated rapidly, and she began experiencing severe pain and light sensitivity. Over the following years, she would require multiple eye surgeries to address the damage, procedures that attempted to repair what that night had destroyed. The medical records from these surgeries documented changes in her eye tissue consistent with radiation exposure, another piece of evidence in a growing puzzle that pointed towards something far beyond a simple encounter with unusual lights. Young Colby, just 7 years old at the time of the encounter, suffered his own trauma, both physical and psychological. The child who had pressed his face against the car window, fascinated by the glowing object above, developed burns on his face and scalp. His hair fell out in patches, leaving him looking like a victim of chemotherapy or radiation treatment. For a child so young to experience such dramatic physical changes was devastating, and the psychological impact would echo through his life for years to come. He had nightmares about that night, about the heat and the light and the helicopters that followed the object through the sky. The physical scars would fade somewhat with time, but the memory of watching his own hair fall out, of seeing the burn spread across his grandmother's face would remain with him forever. The medical documentation that accumulated over the weeks and months following the encounter told a story that mainstream explanations struggled to address. Hospital records detailed burns that multiple physicians compared to radiation exposure injuries. Blood work showed changes consistent with exposure to ionizing radiation. The pattern of symptoms, the timing of their onset, the progression of the illnesses, all pointed toward acute radiation syndrome. Yet the official position remained that these three people had not been exposed to any known source of radiation. No nuclear facility had reported any incident. No radioactive materials had been lost or stolen in the area. Whatever had caused these injuries remained officially unexplained. Betty's suffering extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the encounter. In the years that followed, she developed breast cancer, diagnosed in 1986, less than a year after that night on the isolated road. The cancer required aggressive treatment, adding to the mountain of medical bills that were already threatening to destroy her financially. Medical experts noted that radiation exposure significantly increases cancer risk, particularly for breast cancer in women. While it is impossible to prove definitively that the encounter caused Betty's cancer, the timing and the prior evidence of radiation-like damage to her body created a compelling circumstantial link. The physical deterioration these three people experienced was documented in extraordinary detail. Medical photographs showed the progression of the burns, the patterns of hair loss, the changes in their skin and eyes. Hospital admission records tracked the repeated emergency visits, the desperate attempts to treat symptoms that doctors struggled to understand. Blood tests, tissue samples, specialist consultations, all contributed to a medical file that grew thicker with each passing month. This documentation would become crucial when Betty and Vickie eventually sought legal recourse, attempting to get answers and compensation from a government that seemed determined to deny any knowledge of what had happened that night. The long-term damage extended beyond the physical. Betty's once vibrant life was reduced to a series of medical appointments and procedures. The woman who had owned her own business, who had been strong and independent, found herself increasingly dependent on others as her health deteriorated. Vickie, who had been caring for her grandson, struggled with her own health problems while trying to maintain some sense of normalcy for young Colby. The financial burden was crushing. Medical bills mounted into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, expenses that neither woman could possibly afford. They had done nothing wrong, had simply been driving home on a December evening, yet their lives had been irrevocably destroyed by something that the government insisted did not exist. The suffering of these three people stands as perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Cash-Landrum Incident. This was not simply a sighting of unusual lights in the sky, a story that could be dismissed or explained away with reference to weather phenomena or misidentified aircraft. This was documented medical trauma, real physical damage to real human bodies, injuries that required real medical intervention and left real scars. The medical records do not lie. The photographs do not lie. The testimony of the physicians who treated these patients does not lie. Something happened on that road in December of 1985, something powerful enough to cause radiation-like burns, to trigger acute illness, to leave lasting damage that would plague these witnesses for the rest of their lives. The morning after Betty Cash, Vickie Landrum, and young Colby Landrum encountered the diamond-shaped object on farm to Market Road 1514. They woke to bodies that seemed to be betraying them. Within hours, their symptoms began manifesting in ways that would horrify their doctors and baffle their families. Betty's skin erupted in painful blisters. Her eyes swelled nearly shut. Clumps of her hair came away in her hands as she tried to comb it. Vickie and Colby fared somewhat better, but both experienced severe burns, nausea, and a terrifying sense that something fundamental had changed within their bodies. What they didn't know yet was that their physical suffering would be matched only by the wall of silence they were about to encounter. John Schuessler received the case files in early 1981. As the Deputy Director of Investigations for the Mutual UFO Network, he had examined hundreds of sighting reports over the years. Most were honest misidentifications. Weather balloons, aircraft lights, Venus hanging low on the horizon. But the Cash-Landrum case was different from the moment he opened the folder. Here were medical records documenting radiation-like injuries, hospital admissions, photographs of burns and lesions that made experienced nurses wince. And perhaps most compelling of all, there were multiple witnesses who had reported seeing the same object that night, along with the fleet of helicopters that pursued it. Schuessler approached the investigation with the methodical precision of the aerospace engineer he was. He had worked on the Apollo program at NASA, a man who understood protocols and documentation, who knew that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence. He would give this case that evidence, or he would debunk it entirely. There would be no middle ground. His first task was to interview the witnesses extensively. He sat with Betty Cash in her Houston home, noting how the once vibrant businesswoman now moved like someone decades older. She showed him photographs taken before December 29, 1980. A healthy woman in her early 50s, running her own restaurant, full of energy. Then she showed him the after photographs. The transformation was shocking. Her skin bore marks that her doctors had compared to radiation burns. She had been hospitalized multiple times in the weeks following the incident. Her hair had fallen out in patches. She suffered from chronic diarrhea, vomiting, and a weakness that made simple tasks feel monumental. Vickie Landrum's interview revealed similar patterns. She described the object in identical terms to Betty, despite being questioned separately. The diamond shape, the intense heat, the periodic bursts of flame from its base, the deafening roar. And crucially, both women described the helicopters. They hadn't just seen one or two. They had counted them. 23 large twin-rotor helicopters, like the TH-47 Chinooks used by the military, surrounding and apparently escorting this unknown craft. Young Colby, just 7 years old at the time of the incident, provided his own account. Child witnesses are often the most reliable in some ways because they lack the framework to fabricate complex details. Colby's description matched his grandmother's and Betty's on every significant point. He remembered being terrified. He remembered the heat that made the car's dashboard too hot to touch. He remembered counting helicopters with his grandmother until the numbers became too large for him to track. But Schuessler knew that witness testimony, even consistent witness testimony, wouldn't be enough. He needed physical evidence. He needed corroboration. He needed to trace those helicopters back to their source. The radiation readings came first. Schuessler arranged for a team to visit the site on farm to Market Road 1514, where the encounter had occurred. Using Geiger counters and other detection equipment, they found elevated radiation levels in the area where the witnesses claimed the object had hovered. The readings weren't dramatically high, not enough to indicate a nuclear event, but they were measurably above background levels. Something had been there. Something had left a trace. The medical documentation proved even more compelling. Dr. Brian McClelland, a specialist who examined Betty Cash, noted in his records that her symptoms were consistent with exposure to ionizing radiation. The pattern of burns, the hair loss, the damage to her immune system, all pointed toward radiation exposure. But from what source? Betty was a restaurant owner. She had no access to radioactive materials. She didn't work in a medical facility or a research laboratory. The only unusual event in her life had been that night, on a lonely Texas road. Then Schuessler found the other witnesses. A Dayton police officer named L.L. Alce. Walker reported seeing a large diamond-shaped object flying at low altitude on the night of December 29. His report had been filed before news of the Cash-Landrum encounter became public, eliminating the possibility that he was simply jumping on a bandwagon. An oilfield worker named Jerry McDonald described seeing a huge UFO accompanied by helicopters passing over his trailer. Again, his report was independent, filed before media coverage of the incident. A man named James Cooley contacted investigators to say he had been driving near Huffman that night and had seen an intensely bright light in the sky, along with several helicopters. His wife corroborated his account. They had discussed the strange sight that evening, wondering what kind of military operation could be occurring. Each witness added another layer of credibility. These weren't UFO enthusiasts comparing notes at a convention. These were ordinary people, many of whom had never reported anything unusual in their lives, all describing the same phenomenon, from different vantage points across the same area of southeast Texas. Schuessler compiled everything into a comprehensive report. Maps showing the object's flight path based on multiple witness accounts. Medical records with doctors' signatures and hospital stamps. radiation readings with dates and locations, photographs of the witnesses' injuries at various stages, testimony transcripts. He built a case that would have satisfied most courts of law. Then he began making inquiries with the military. This was where the walls started going up. The Army's response came first. No Army helicopters were operating in that area on the night in question. Their records showed no flight activity matching the witnesses' descriptions. It was a flat denial, delivered in the crisp language of official military correspondence. Schuessler pointed out that multiple witnesses had identified the helicopters as twin rotorcraft consistent with Chinooks, which were Army aircraft. The response didn't change. No Army helicopters were in the area. The Air Force followed with a similar denial. No Air Force operations were conducted in southeast Texas on December 29, 1980. No aircraft matching the description of the diamond-shaped object were in their inventory. They could offer no explanation for what the witnesses had seen, but they could state definitively that it wasn't theirs. NASA received detailed inquiries. Given Schuessler's background with the space agency, he had hoped for at least a thorough response. Instead, he received bureaucratic silence. NASA had no comment. They had no records of any operations in the area. They had no experimental craft that matched the description. The door closed politely but firmly. The Department of Defense provided the same stone wall. Every branch of the military, every government agency that might conceivably operate advanced aircraft or conduct tests that could produce radiation exposure, they all said the same thing. It wasn't us. We weren't there. We can't help you. Betty Cash and Vickie Landrum watched their medical bills pile higher. Betty's health continued to deteriorate. She had been forced to sell her restaurant. The medical expenses were crushing her financially. Vickie struggled to care for Colby while dealing with her own ongoing health issues. They needed answers, but more than that, they needed someone to take responsibility for what had happened to them. In August of 1986, they made the decision to sue. Betty Cash and Vickie and Colby Landrum filed a lawsuit against the United States government for $20 million. The suit named the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, and the Department of Defense as defendants. It alleged that a government device had caused them severe physical injury and ongoing medical problems. It sought compensation for medical expenses, pain and suffering, and loss of livelihood. The case was assigned to Federal Judge Ross Sterling in Houston. As the proceedings unfolded, something remarkable happened. Judge Sterling listened to the evidence. He reviewed the medical records, the witness statements, the radiation readings. He heard testimony about the helicopters, about the systematic denials from every branch of government, and he expressed something that Betty and Vickie hadn't heard from an official source in all the years since their encounter. Sympathy. From the bench, Judge Sterling acknowledged that something had clearly happened to these people. Their injuries were real. Their suffering was documented. The consistency of their accounts and the corroborating witnesses suggested this was not a fabrication. But then came the legal reality that would doom their case. To prevail in a lawsuit against the government, the plaintiffs had to prove that the government owned the object that had injured them. Despite all the evidence they had compiled, despite the helicopters that suggested military involvement, despite the denials that seemed to protest too much, they could not definitively prove ownership. The government denied having any such craft. Without proof of ownership, the case could not proceed. In August of 1986, Judge Sterling dismissed the lawsuit. His written opinion conveyed regret. These were credible witnesses who had suffered genuine harm, but the law required proof that the plaintiffs had not been able to provide. The judge couldn't rule on speculation, no matter how compelling. The dismissal felt like a final door slamming shut. Betty Cash would continue to suffer health problems for the rest of her life. She died in December of 1998, never receiving answers about what had happened to her on that Texas road. Vickie Landrum maintained until her death in 2007 that the government knew exactly what had caused their injuries and had chosen to hide behind denials and bureaucratic walls. John Schuessler never stopped investigating. He continued to compile evidence, to interview witnesses, to push for official acknowledgement. The Cash-Landrum case became one of the most thoroughly documented UFO encounters in history, with a paper trail that stretched across government agencies and filled boxes with medical records. testimony transcripts, and official denials. The case revealed something beyond the mystery of what the object actually was. It exposed the impenetrable nature of government secrecy when authorities choose to invoke it. Whether the object was a classified military project, an experimental craft being tested without proper safety protocols, or something else entirely, the result was the same. Denial. Deflection. The machinery of official silence grinding any attempt at accountability into dust. 3 people saw something that burned them, that made them sick, that changed their lives forever. Dozens of other witnesses saw pieces of the same event. Doctors documented injuries consistent with radiation exposure. Investigators found elevated radiation at the site. And yet, officially, nothing happened. No one was responsible. The object that so many people saw that December night simply didn't exist in any government record or official file. The walls of denial had held. The search for answers had led only to closed doors and empty responses. And the truth, whatever it was, remained locked away behind classifications and clearances that the injured parties would never be allowed to breach. The official story had always been simple, almost dismissive in its brevity. An unidentified object flew over Texas. Helicopters followed it. No explanation necessary. But what if that very simplicity was designed to obscure something far more dangerous? What if the craft, witnessed by hundreds of people that night, was not extraterrestrial at all, but something equally terrifying and infinitely more classified? What if the greatest mystery was not where it came from, but what it was carrying, and why it was being transported over populated areas in the dead of night? To understand what might have been flying through Texas airspace, we need to step back into the shadows of the Cold War, into the realm of projects so classified that their very existence was denied for decades. During the height of atomic paranoia in the 1950s and 60s, the United States military pursued technological ambitions that bordered on madness. They dreamed of nuclear-powered aircraft that could stay airborne for months, of atomic ramjets that would streak through the atmosphere, leaving trails of radiation in their wake, of weapons so advanced that conventional thinking could not even categorize them. One such program was Project Pluto, and its very existence should disturb anyone who learns its details. Initiated in 1957, Pluto was designed to create a nuclear-powered cruise missile called SLAM, which stood for Supersonic Low-Altitude Missile. The concept was apocalyptic in its design. This weapon would use an unshielded nuclear reactor to superheat air, creating thrust that would propel the missile at speeds exceeding Mach 3. It would fly at treetop level, following terrain unstoppable by conventional defenses. The shockwave from its passage would destroy buildings. The radiation from its unshielded reactor would poison everything in its path. And when it finally reached its target zone, it would release multiple nuclear warheads before the reactor itself became a final, dirty bomb. Engineers actually built and tested components of this nightmare device. At the Nevada test site, they constructed the Tory reactor series, testing nuclear ramjet engines that worked exactly as designed. The Tory-2, a reactor, was tested in May of 1961, successfully demonstrating that an unshielded nuclear reactor could indeed power sustained flight. The Tory-2C followed in 1964, running at full power for 5 minutes, proving the concept was viable. These were not theoretical exercises. They were functional tests of a weapons system that would fundamentally alter the nature of warfare and civilian safety alike. The program was officially canceled in 1964, deemed too dangerous, too indiscriminate, too horrifying even by Cold War standards. But was it truly canceled, or merely driven deeper into the classified realm? Black budget programs have a way of continuing long after their public termination date. The infrastructure existed. The technology worked. The military had invested hundreds of millions of dollars in proving that nuclear-powered flight was possible. Would they simply walk away? Consider what witnesses described seeing over Texas. A massive craft, silent or nearly so, glowing with an internal light. Heat signatures detected from the ground. The involvement of multiple military helicopters in close formation, maintaining specific distances from the object. These details align disturbingly well with what a nuclear-powered aircraft would require for transport or testing. The silence could be explained by ramjet technology operating at low power. The glow could be thermal radiation from reactor shielding. The helicopter escort would be absolutely mandatory for radiological monitoring and safety protocol. Former military personnel have spoken, carefully and often anonymously, about black programs operating out of facilities across Texas and New Mexico during this era. One retired Air Force technician, speaking to researchers in the late 1990s, described witnessing the transport of what he called exotic propulsion systems through Dyess Air Force Base near Abilene in the mid-1980s. He described security protocols unlike anything he had encountered in his 20-year career. Radiation badges for personnel who merely came near the sealed transport containers. Decontamination showers required after shifts. Medical monitoring that continued for years afterward. He was told nothing about what he was guarding, but the precautions told him everything he needed to know. Whatever was in those containers was radioactive, experimental, and classified beyond top secret. Another theory, darker still, involves not the testing of exotic aircraft, but the transport of nuclear weapons themselves, possibly involving an accident or malfunction that required emergency relocation. The United States military has a documented history of broken arrows, the official term for nuclear weapon accidents. Between 1950 and 1980, the Department of Defense officially acknowledged 32 such incidents. How many went unacknowledged? How many were classified so deeply that even the accident reports remain sealed? Transporting nuclear weapons by air is standard military procedure, but these movements follow strict protocols and designated routes carefully planned to avoid population centers. What would cause such a transport to deviate from safe corridors and fly low over civilian areas? A malfunction in the transport aircraft, forcing an emergency descent. A security threat requiring immediate rerouting. Or perhaps the weaponization of radiation propulsion technology that made conventional transport methods obsolete, replacing them with something that looked like science fiction but was terrifyingly real. The helicopter escort becomes crucial evidence in this interpretation. Military protocols for nuclear weapon, transport mandate, constant monitoring, and security. If the object was a damaged aircraft or container carrying radioactive material, the helicopters would serve multiple purposes. They would monitor radiation levels to ensure containment integrity. They would provide security against potential interception or observation. They would be ready to respond if the situation deteriorated further. The specific distances witnesses reported between the helicopters and the central object align with safety protocols for radiological exposure. Too close, and the crews would accumulate dangerous doses. Too far, and they could not effectively monitor or respond to changes in the situation. What makes this scenario particularly chilling is the question of civilian exposure. If the object was leaking radiation, or if its propulsion system was inherently radioactive, then everyone who witnessed it that night may have been exposed. Every person who stood in their yard watching it pass overhead. Every driver who pulled over to get a better look. Every family that gathered outside, pointing and wondering. The government would face an impossible choice. Acknowledge the exposure and trigger mass panic, potentially revealing classified programs that cost billions and took decades to develop. D. Or remain silent, monitor the affected population covertly, and hope that exposure levels were low enough to avoid detectable health consequences. There are precedents for such calculations. During the 50s and 60s, the Atomic Energy Commission conducted radiation experiments on unwitting civilians. They released radioactive particles into populated areas to study dispersal patterns. They injected hospital patients with plutonium to observe biological effects. When these programs finally came to light decades later, the justifications offered were always the same. National security. The greater good. The need to understand radiation effects to protect against Soviet attack. The individuals harmed were acceptable losses in a larger strategic context. Would the military apply the same logic to an accidental exposure from a classified transport or test? The calculations would be purely mathematical. Estimated exposure levels multiplied by affected population equals projected casualties. If that number fell below a certain threshold, silence might seem like the rational choice. No mass evacuation that would reveal the incident. No medical monitoring that would confirm exposure. Just quiet observation and plausible deniability. Witnesses have reported unusual health issues in the years following their sighting. Cancers appearing in unusual clusters. Autoimmune disorders developing in previously healthy individuals. These reports are anecdotal, unverified, impossible to definitively link to any single cause. But they persist, whispered in online forums and local conversation, creating a narrative of exposure and abandonment that fits disturbingly well with documented government behavior in similar situations. The legal response becomes evidence in itself. When witnesses sought answers through official channels, they encountered walls of classification and denial. When lawsuits were filed seeking information under the Freedom of Information Act, the government fought them with resources that seemed disproportionate to the supposed non-event. Documents were withheld, citing national security exemptions. Witnesses were interviewed by military investigators and asked to sign non-disclosure agreements decades after the incident. Why would a simple misidentification of conventional aircraft warrant such aggressive information control? The answer may lie in what those documents would reveal. Not alien contact, but something potentially more disturbing to the public consciousness. Evidence that experimental nuclear technology was being transported or tested over civilian populations without notification or consent. Proof that safety protocols were violated or never existed for these exotic programs. Documentation of exposure levels and health monitoring of affected civilians conducted without their knowledge. The revelation that the government prioritized secrecy over safety, classification over constitutional rights. Stealth technology development adds another layer to this dark tapestry. The F-117 Nighthawk, America's first operational stealth aircraft, was developed in absolute secrecy beginning in the late 1970s and flew operational missions for years before its public acknowledgement in 1988. During its classified development phase, test flights occurred over remote areas of Nevada, but transits to and from test ranges necessarily crossed more populated regions. Witnesses who reported strange aircraft during this period were dismissed, their sightings attributed to misidentification or fabrication. Only decades later did the truth emerge, validating observations that had been officially denied. What other technologies were being developed in parallel programs even more classified than the stealth fighter? What propulsion systems, what materials, what weapons platforms existed in the black budget world that have still never been publicly acknowledged? The sighting over Texas occurred during a period of intense technological development, when defense spending reached unprecedented levels and classification protocols expanded to cover entire categories of research. The terrifying implication is not that we were visited by something from beyond our world, but that we were overflown by something from within it. Something our own government created, tested, and transported with such disregard for civilian safety that they would rather face lawsuits, endure decades of speculation, and maintain absolute denial than simply acknowledge what happened. The truth in this interpretation is not out there among the stars. It is buried in classified archives, sealed under layers of security clearances, protected by legal precedents that prioritize state secrets over individual rights. And if this interpretation is correct, then the mystery is not what flew over Texas that night, but how many other nights saw similar flights over other communities. How many other witnesses stood unknowingly in the shadow of radioactive experiments or weapons transports? How many other populations were deemed acceptable risks in the pursuit of technological advancement and military superiority? The Cash-Landrum incident may not be unique. It may simply be the one that could not be entirely suppressed, the one where witnesses were too credible, too injured, too persistent to be easily dismissed. It may be the visible tip of a much larger and darker reality. The lights inside Parkway Hospital burned through the long Texas nights as Betty Cash returned again and again, her body betraying her in ways the doctors had never seen before. Within days of that December encounter, her skin began to peel away in sheets, revealing raw flesh underneath that wept and blistered. The nurses had to change her bedding constantly, the fabric sticking to wounds that wouldn't heal. Her hair came out in clumps, filling the pillowcase with dark strands until she was nearly bald. The woman who had built a successful restaurant business with her own two hands now couldn't hold a glass of water without her fingers splitting open at the joints. The pattern became numbingly familiar. Betty would be released, attempt to go home, and within weeks find herself back in the emergency room with new symptoms that defied easy explanation. Her eyes swelled shut, the lids so inflamed she couldn't see. Diarrhea racked her body for days at a time, leaving her dehydrated and weak. Her weight dropped from a healthy 130 pounds to barely 90. She developed cataracts that clouded her vision, requiring surgery to remove. The doctors noted similarities they didn't want to say out loud at first, but eventually the words appeared in her medical records. Her symptoms resembled those of radiation exposure victims. Specifically, they noted, her condition bore striking similarities to survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Vickie Landrum experienced her own cascade of medical horrors. The brilliant Houston sun became her enemy as her eyes deteriorated rapidly. The damage was permanent, the doctors explained, the kind of injury that suggested exposure to intense light or radiation. She developed severe vision problems that never improved, forcing her to navigate her world through a painful blur. The headaches came in waves that left her bedridden, and like Betty, her hair fell out in disturbing quantities. Stomach problems plagued her constantly. The vibrant woman who had been driving home from dinner that December night became a shadow, moving carefully through rooms that seemed too bright, too loud, too overwhelming. But perhaps the cruelest twist of fate belonged to 7-year-old Colby Landrum. A child who should have been losing himself in comic books and playground games instead watched the two women he loved most in the world slowly come apart. His own symptoms appeared quickly. Blisters formed on his skin where the light had touched him through the car window. His hair thinned noticeably. But the deepest wounds were the ones no doctor could measure or treat. Night after night, he would wake screaming from nightmares, seeing that diamond of fire hovering over the road, feeling the heat pressing against his face. He developed a fear of the dark that consumed him, unable to sleep without every light in the house burning. How do you explain to a child why his grandmother moves so slowly now? Why Betty, who used to laugh and ruffle his hair, can barely get out of bed? The medical bills began to arrive like a second assault. $2,000, $5,000, $10,000. Betty watched helplessly as the numbers climbed higher and higher, each hospitalization adding another layer of debt she could never hope to repay. Her restaurant, the Dayton Cafe, had been her pride and joy, a place where locals gathered and where her hard work had finally paid off. But running a restaurant requires presence, energy, hands that don't split and bleed when you grip a pot handle. She tried to keep working, pushing through the pain and exhaustion, but her body simply couldn't sustain the effort anymore. Within months, she had to sell the business at a loss. The dream she had built was gone, sacrificed to medical appointments and hospital stays and a crushing fatigue that never lifted. The total medical expenses eventually exceeded $200,000, a sum so staggering it might as well have been $2 million for all of Betty's ability to pay it. She filed for bankruptcy, watching her financial life disintegrate along with her health. Every cent she had saved, every bit of equity, every small comfort she had worked decades to achieve vanished into the bottomless well of medical debt. And still, her body continued to fail in new and terrible ways. The three of them filed a lawsuit, of course. What else could they do? They sued the United States government for $20 million, seeking acknowledgement and compensation for what had been done to them. The case crawled through the courts with excruciating slowness. In August of 1986, Judge Ross Sterling handed down his ruling, and with it, crushed any hope they might have held. He dismissed the case, stating that the Federal Tort Claims Act prevented lawsuits against the government for damages arising from military activities during times of war. But there was no war, they protested. We weren't soldiers. We were civilians, driving home on a Texas highway. It didn't matter. The law was the law, and the law protected the government from accountability. What followed was perhaps even more painful than the physical suffering. The government offered them nothing. No explanation, no compensation, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had even occurred. Officials issued carefully worded statements that no military aircraft or experimental vehicles had been in the area that night. The implication was clear. If the government had nothing in the sky, then Betty, Vickie, and Colby must be lying or mistaken or delusional. Never mind the medical records. Never mind the testimony of other witnesses who saw the same object. Never mind the physical evidence of trees damaged along that stretch of road. their tops burned as if by intense heat from above. The community that had once embraced Betty and supported her business began to pull away. Some people believed their story but feared being associated with it, worried that showing support might bring unwanted government attention. Others bought into the official denials and decided the three of them were either fabricating the encounter for attention or had somehow misinterpreted what they saw. But the most painful rejection came from those who feared contagion. People whispered that whatever had happened to Betty and Vickie might be catching, that standing too close or shaking their hands might transfer the illness. Old friends stopped calling. Customers who had been regulars at the restaurant crossed the street to avoid Betty when they saw her in town. The isolation wrapped around them like a suffocating blanket, cutting them off from the support networks they desperately needed. Children at Colby's school picked up on the strangeness surrounding his family. Kids can be viciously perceptive about vulnerability, and they sensed something different about the boy whose grandmother looked sick all the time, whose family claimed they'd seen a UFO. The teasing started small, but grew meaner. Colby the alien. Colby the liar. Colby who sees things that aren't real. He withdrew further into himself, the trauma of the original encounter compounded by the daily humiliation of being marked as other, as damaged as the weird kid whose family wouldn't shut up about something everyone knew was fake. Betty's health continued its devastating decline through the years. The cancer appeared in the mid-1990s, diagnosed with the clinical detachment of a doctor who had watched her suffer for over a decade. By that point, it almost seemed inevitable, one more betrayal by a body that had been fighting a losing war since that December night. She endured treatments, but the cancer had its hooks in deep. In 1998, 18 years after she drove down that highway and saw something that shouldn't exist, Betty Cash died. The official cause of death listed cancer, but those who knew her story, understood the truth, ran deeper. The radiation, if that's what it was, had spent nearly 2 decades killing her slowly, stealing her vitality piece by piece, until there was nothing left to take. Vickie Landrum outlived her friend by nearly a decade, but those years brought no peace. Her health problems persisted, a constant reminder of that night. The eye damage never healed. The mysterious ailments would flare up without warning, sending her back to doctors who could treat symptoms but never address the underlying cause. She carried the burden of watching Betty die, knowing the same thing was likely happening inside her own body, just on a slower timeline. When Vickie passed away in 2007, it closed the book on 2 lives, utterly transformed and ultimately destroyed by 15 minutes on a dark Texas road. Colby survived, but survival is not the same as living unscathed. He grew up haunted by memories of that night and by the trauma of watching his grandmother and Betty suffer for years with no explanation, no justice, no acknowledgement. The government he had been taught to trust in school had looked at their documented injuries and medical records and decided that protecting its secrets mattered more than protecting 3 of its citizens. That lesson, learned young, leaves marks that never fade. The final insult came in the form of silence. No official ever apologized. No investigation ever vindicated their claims. No compensation ever arrived to cover even a fraction of the $200,000 in medical bills. Betty died in poverty, her business gone, her savings depleted, her body destroyed. Vickie spent her final years knowing she would receive no answers. Colby lost his childhood to fear and his family to an invisible enemy they couldn't fight or understand. 3 people whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time, who saw something the government couldn't allow them to have seen, and who paid for that accident of timing with everything they had. The Cash-Landrum Incident stands as a monument to the human cost of secrecy, a reminder that behind every classified program and every denied operation, there may be ordinary people whose lives are being ground to dust in the machinery of national security. The files remain sealed. Decades have passed since that December night in 1980, and still the government holds its secrets close, wrapped in classification stamps and bureaucratic stone walls. Freedom of Information Act requests have yielded nothing but redactions and denials. The documents that might explain what Betty Cash, Vickie Landrum, and young Colby witnessed that night, what burned their skin and poisoned their cells, remain locked away in filing cabinets that the public will never access. Somewhere in those classified archives lies the truth about what flew over that Texas road, escorted by 23 military helicopters. Somewhere, someone knows exactly what happened, and they have chosen silence over justice. The questions hang in the air like radiation itself, invisible but present, impossible to ignore. What was that craft? The witnesses described it in precise detail. Diamond-shaped, massive, belching fire from its underside, hovering above the pines with a roar that shook the earth. This was no distant light in the sky, no ambiguous blur that could be explained away. Betty, Vickie, and Colby saw it close enough to feel its heat through the windshield, close enough to count the helicopters that surrounded it. And yet, officially it does not exist. The Air Force says it wasn't theirs. The Army says the same. The Navy, the Department of Defense, every branch of military and government has looked at the evidence and said, we know nothing. But they sent 23 helicopters. That single fact cuts through every denial like a knife. Those aircraft were real. Vickie and Colby identified them specifically, twin-rotor Chinooks and the distinctive profile of Huey helicopters. These were military birds, operating in formation, escorting something so dangerous, so important, that they surrounded it in the night sky over a public highway. Someone ordered that mission. Someone coordinated those pilots. Someone made the decision that moving this object, whatever it was worth the risk of public exposure. And when that exposure happened, when 3 innocent people suffered the consequences, someone made another decision. Deny everything. Why were military helicopters escorting something so intensely radioactive over a civilian road? The question answers itself in the most disturbing way. Whatever that craft was, whatever program it belonged to, it was considered more important than public safety. The route took it directly over areas where people lived, worked, and traveled. Betty, Vickie, and Colby just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, but they could have been anyone. They could have been a school bus full of children. They could have been a family heading home from Christmas shopping. The operation proceeded anyway, because whatever classified program was underway, it outweighed the risk to human life. 3 people's lives were considered acceptable collateral damage. That's the cold calculation at the heart of this mystery. Betty Cash died slowly, her body destroyed by radiation exposure that left her unrecognizable. Vickie Landrum suffered for years, her health shattered, her quality of life stolen. Colby, just 7 years old, carried the physical and psychological scars into adulthood. These were not anonymous statistics. They had names, families, futures that were ripped away. And the response from those responsible? A wall of silence so absolute, so coordinated, that it could only have come from the highest levels of authority. The evidence was overwhelming, yet it meant nothing against the power of official denial. Medical records documented radiation injuries consistent with massive exposure. Multiple witnesses reported seeing the helicopters. Testimonies were consistent, detailed, and credible. Investigators found that Betty, Vickie, and Colby had no reason to fabricate their story, no history of seeking attention or making false claims. They were ordinary people who experienced something extraordinary and paid a terrible price. But without the government's admission, without access to classified files, their suffering became a footnote to a mystery rather than a recognized injustice. This pattern repeats itself. Similar incidents have been reported near military installations across the country. Witnesses describe strange craft, unusual lights, formations of military helicopters in areas where no training exercises were scheduled. Most never report what they see, knowing the response they'll receive: disbelief, ridicule, or worse. The few who do come forward hit the same wall of denial that Betty and Vickie encountered. The message is clear. Some secrets are more important than accountability. Some programs exist beyond the reach of public scrutiny, protected by layers of classification that make truth impossible to prove and justice impossible to achieve. The truth didn't die with Betty Cash in December of 1998. It didn't fade when Vickie Landrum passed in 2007. It exists, preserved in documents that bear stamps reading top secret or classified or whatever designation keeps them hidden from the families who deserve answers. It exists in the memories of the helicopter pilots who flew that night, who surely remember escorting something strange over the Texas darkness. It exists in the records of whatever facility launched or recovered that craft, in the mission logs and incident reports that chronicle what really happened when 3 civilians got too close to something they were never meant to see. Somewhere, in a secure facility, whose location we can only guess at, someone could pull a file and explain everything. They could identify the craft, name the program, reveal the technology that burned through human flesh, and left Colby's handprints permanently marked on his grandmother's dashboard. They could explain why the operation proceeded over a public road, who authorized it, what failures allowed civilians to encounter it. They could provide the documentation that would validate Betty and Vickie's lawsuit, that would prove their suffering was real and their injuries were caused by something the government deployed. They could offer the truth that would bring a measure of peace to the families who watched their loved ones sicken and die. But they choose silence. Day after day, year after year, decade after decade, the choice is made again. Protect the secret, deny the truth, maintain the cover-up. The classification stamps remain in place. The Freedom of Information requests continue to return nothing. The official position never wavers. And the message that sends is perhaps the most chilling aspect of this entire mystery. Your government can harm you, can poison you, can destroy your life. And if the program is classified enough, if the secret is deemed important enough, they will never admit it. They will never face consequences. They will simply deny, deflect, and wait for you to die. The Cash-Landrum Incident stands as a monument to that injustice, a case so well documented, so thoroughly investigated, so obviously real, that the denial required to maintain it reveals the true depth of governmental power over truth itself. The witnesses are gone now, but the questions remain, hanging over that stretch of Texas highway, like the craft itself once hovered, burning and impossible and absolutely real. What was it? Who operated it? Why were those people sacrificed? And why, after all these years, after all the suffering and death, does someone still believe the secret is worth protecting? The answers exist. They wait in locked rooms, in classified databases, in the minds of those who know and choose not to speak. And they will likely remain there, untouched and unacknowledged, until the program itself becomes obsolete or the people who remember it are gone. That is the haunting reality at the heart of this mystery. Justice delayed until everyone who deserves it is dead. Truth preserved but never revealed. And 3 innocent people who encountered something extraordinary, reduced to a mystery that will never officially be solved. Because somewhere, someone knows exactly what happened that night, and they have decided that you never will. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.